afternoon. Study session here at City Council meeting, 4 p.m. Wednesday, October the 6th, 2021, City Hall Complex. I call this meeting to order. Please rise for the pledge of allegiance. Madam Clerk, will you please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Really knew how proud I am when I pledge of allegiance and I look at that phone. Helps me to necessities. Okay, number 3, discussion item. Discussion and direction funding options for PSPRS unfunded liability. Mr. Massey or John?
Sir, Mr. Mayor, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
In our last meeting, I promised that we would bring you back funding options and an explanation of funding options for our PSPRS liability. I know it's a very tough issue, and it's a very complicated issue. I have Mr. Michael Vasquez and Ms. Pat Walker here to help us go through this presentation, and at this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Vasquez. Michael.
Sure. Okay.
Oh, and I got Jean. I'm sorry, Jean.
I'm just going to do another introduction.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I didn't think you needed an introduction,
well,
Jean.
not for me.
Yeah.
For them. So, mayor and member of the council, today, Pat Walker, our financial consultant, and our financial advisor, Michael Vasquez, are here to provide the presentation for the fire and the police unfunded liability of the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System, our PSPRS, for the city of Nogales. This is a topic that the council has wanted further discussion on, so Michael, Pat, and myself have been working on the analysis. This is something that we will continue to work on and will be coming back to the council for follow-up. And with this, I'll turn it over to Pat, who isn't here, but is there.
Mayor and members of the council, yes, this has been a topic, not just for the city of Nogales, but it was a hot topic. It was discussed at different conferences in numerous cities and towns throughout Arizona, because unfortunately everybody's facing this unfunded liability. And so today what we're going to do is kind of walk through what the unfunded liability is and financing options and everything else. This won't be a meeting where anything's decided, but at least we're going to be able to brief you on what the problem is. I know you had a presentation from PSPRS Clark Partridge a few weeks ago, and he presented the information from the viewpoint of PSPRS. We're going to present from the viewpoint of what makes sense for the city of Nogales moving forward. So with that, this is a slide we wanted to include because Michael and I both love this saying, compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, he who doesn't pays it. And it's something that we're going to be talking about as we go through this presentation, and that's why the problem gets bigger and bigger for unfunded liability because of the compounding of the interest over time. Just as a backdrop and history a little bit here, on June 30th, 2020, as of June 30th, the unfunded liability for police was $17.7 million and for fire, $16.3 million. In 2019, Council adopted a PSPRS system policy that set a goal for the payoff of the unfunded liability by 2036. Now, this was required by the state statute to adopt a policy. And in the policy, it's very vague about how you're going to get there, but you would set a goal to pay off by 2036. The thought process behind it is that if you didn't set a goal and other cities and towns didn't do anything between now and 2036, there was the potential that state shared revenues would be redirected towards the payoff. So there's been a lot been happening since the last time we talked about this a year ago. And at that time, we talked about setting aside $2 million in the 2021 budget. That money's still there, has not been spent. It's in that contingency reserve that we have. And then currently in fiscal year 21-22, we have 8.3 million in unappropriated fund balance in the general fund. Well, this is a chart from the Arizona Public Safety Retirement System. They have an actuarial company that Foster & Foster that does this for everybody in the system's particular city or town. So this is based on Nogales' unfunded liability. And the official term is the Unfunded Actuarial Accrued Liability, UAAL. You'll see that on some of the slides, but I'm just going to refer to it, and Michael's just going to refer to it as unfunded liability. What you owe, and it's got a lot of assumptions in it. And again, you're going to hear us caveat that, and this is just police only, but an actuarial is really looking at how much interest do you think you're going to earn on the investments of the PSPRS for your particular assets that they have for the city of Nogales, and that is projected at 7.3%. And it's also looking at how many people are going to be retiring, when they're retiring, when they might die, what will their dependents receive. It's a lot of assumptions that's made. And if everything comes true in all their assumptions, then the liability is 17.7 and you're only 51.1% funded. They like to see it, and that's the whole goal of that 2036 date, is they want to see 100% there instead of 51.1 by 2036. Well, then this is a chart that's also provided by them that if you were to pay for your unfunded liability on an annual basis from June of 21 through June of 38, which is interesting because they made that date for 36, but this is how they calculate the unfunded liability. You would have to contribute $1,239,088 in 21, and then another $1,425,000 in 22. Now, again, this is police only. So at the end of the day, based on all their assumptions, and you would make this plan like you do a mortgage payment on a house, you would actually be, let me hide this here. You'd be actually spending $36,296,126. If you back into present value, back to 7.3% off, that's how you get to your 17 million. So if you were to pay it off today, you would pay off 17 million for the police liability. And if you just made annual contributions towards paying it off directly to PSPRS, then it would be $36 million. This is the fire portion of it, and as you can see, the fire is $16.3 million on the unfunded liability, or 46.4%. Doing the same calculations, looking at a 7.3 interest earnings, you would be paying $32,646,082 versus the 16 million. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Michael to do a few slides, unless you want to add some more things, Michael, because we're going to tag team this presentation.
Excellent. And the only thing that I would add is on those cash flow statements, the reason that we provided them is because we wanted to show that when we talk about an unfunded liability and we're talking about 17 million and 16 million for police and fire respectively, we wanted to let you know that that's really the good side of things. The 17 and the 16 is assuming that the retirement system earns 7.3%. So the closer that 7.3 gets to zero, the more you pay and the closer to those big numbers you see on those cash flow charts. Pat, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, you're up then on this section.
Okay, pension obligation bonds. Let's start off with that nationally. We have been doing pension obligation bonds since the early 80s, and these are done taxable per IRS regulations, no matter who you are, what municipality, no matter what state you're in, they're done taxable. And the reason that there have been cycles of issuers throughout the nation doing POBs is because taxables don't always track next to tax exempt rates. And therefore, there are times at which taxable rates make sense, and there are times when they do not. Right now, we are on the floor for For all intents and purposes, we are at historical lows for taxable rates for municipalities. So that's why we are looking at these. The three types of debt or credits that are used nationally are: one, general obligation bonds, and these are voter approved. So the city or a school district or a county would go out to the voters, ask for approval for a certain amount to issue debt over a certain time. If the voters approve, that would allow that municipality to levy a secondary property tax with which you would repay the bond debt service. The next type of credit is excise tax revenue obligations, and the city currently has a form of this, and we're going to get to this in a second. In this particular credit, most of the time, voter approval is not required. The last type of credit is a certificate of participation, which is not backed by a property tax or a revenue pledge. It is backed by a municipality's assets, so a building, city hall, fire buildings, so on and so forth. Those are the three main types of credits. We're going to get into a little bit more about how they apply to the city in a couple pages. Pat, if we can skip forward one page, please. So we've been hearing a lot about POBs. Certain counties, certain cities are doing it, and I think for the most part, they're very positively politicized. So some examples of transactions that have occurred here in Arizona. The city of Flagstaff was the first city to do this in Arizona, and they issued $131 million in certificates of participation. The city of Tucson did one towards the beginning of this year. Piper Sandler was financial advisor on that, and they did $658 million in COPs. The city of Douglas did $38.8 million, and they did it as an excise tax revenue bond, similar to what the city has. The city of Prescott and the city of Globe did not issue debt. They raised or set aside a separate excise tax and are using that annually to fund the unfunded liability contribution. Santa Cruz County is currently considering issuing debt, and it would be in the form of excise tax. And that would be in the neighborhood of approximately $8 to $10 million. Pima County did one for $300 million excise tax, and Yuma County also did a $35 million excise tax. So there have been a number of debt issuances in Arizona, either by COP or excise tax secured debt. Nobody has gone to the voters for GO approval yet. Any questions?
Michael, if I can. Michael?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to add one thing here. There's also cities that aren't doing anything. The city of Surprise is not issuing any debt, and they're just, they've got reserves that they've been using to pay the unfunded liability, but there are numerous cities in Arizona that haven't issued debt to do it too. So just to have a balance here. The town of Chino Valley, they are setting aside an amount every year because they've got the room to do that and pay it off without issuing debt. And if they don't have to issue debt, then, and they're not earning anything on their cash, they're putting a cash contribution towards it. So there's numerous ways that either they're addressing it or they're going to address it later, or it's kind of a wait and see mode because there were so many POBs that flooded the market this year. A lot of the unfunded liability overall was brought down by a lot of cities by doing that. And we'll get more into that in the presentation. But the bottom line is that there's just numerous ways you can address this. Thanks, Michael.
You're welcome. I'm done with that page.
Okay. All right, the next one is general obligation bonds, and as we said, and Michael recapped, that requires voter approval. That would be the November of 22 election in order to levy, and then you would have to levy a secondary property tax to pay back the bond debt service, which right now we know that the city of Nogales has no property tax, primary or secondary. But even with voter approval, it will be taxable interest rates. And however, that usually is a little bit higher than non-taxable, but right now because of the market, they're about the same. And it is at historical lows. And the thing is that if you have to wait till November of 22 election, we cannot guarantee nor would anybody, that you're going to be able to get these historic low interest rates. And in fact, the outlook is they are going to go up. Certificates of participation, again, this is not possible because you need a COP credit, which requires an asset or a city building pledge. And the majority of the city buildings are currently encumbered under the city's municipal development authority revenue credit. MDA, that's the municipal development authority, possible, but this is currently the city's only available credit to finance large capital improvements. And the emphasis we want to make on this is that and that's why we're offering a lot of choices, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, what large capital programs you may have, and then are you going to be tying up your hands if you go and pay off an entire POB, pension obligation bond debt with pension obligations. So you're tying up your capacity maybe to get credit for other things that come up in future years. Your current rating is AA-, is stable. As you recall, Council, we were able to get that from a negative outlook to a stable, which is positive news. Additional bonds test, you have to cover your annual pledged excise tax revenue divided by the annual debt service, and from a gross pledge, it's currently at 8.2. But every new debt that you would add would make that test harder and harder unless your sales taxes increase. So,
Pat, excuse me, Pat, would you like to cover the gross pledge and kind of what that means to the city?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So a gross pledge, it's important to understand when we say that the city has capacity to issue additional debt. So in Arizona and a lot of states, a government's pledge when they do a bond issue is gross pledge. That means that all the money that they receive directly from excise taxes, from the state on all levels, that goes into a bucket. And the bondholder, through the trustee, is the first one that gets to take a grab at those revenues. So even though you potentially have capacity under those covenants, that's not to say that you really have capacity after you cover all your real M&O costs at the city. Does that make sense?
Okay, so does the city have financing capability with MDA revenue credit? Well, if the city were to try and finance a significant portion of that 17 and 16 million, 50% plus of the unfunded liability, we should prepare for a rating downgrade. And what's that mean, and what are the consequences? Well, it may mean that you don't have any impact unless you're going to be going back out again pretty soon for another loan or financing or something like that. And then what happens with the city's only revenue source, excise tax, begin to suffer over the next few years. And that's what I was referring to, that it's, again, based on a gamble that if you use up that pledged amount and then the sales taxes decline, that could be a problem. So, Michael, you want to explain the MDA? You just had a meeting on this not too long ago.
Yes, ma'am. Fairly easy. I won't spend too much time. This sheet right here is a summary of all of the outstanding issues for Nogales Municipal Development Authority. And it shows on an individual basis what the debt service is, and it shows what it looks like on an aggregate basis to the far right. So the number I would take away from here is that the city has approximately a $2.2 million annual debt service through 2038. That's all, Pat. This one, I won't spend too much time on it. This is just a quick chart to show how the transaction flows in a POB issue. It shows, where the money comes from and how it flows through the transaction and ultimately funds the retirement system. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on it unless anybody has specific questions. Okay, so potential risks. We have a lot of them here. Let's start with market risk. The first is we need to make sure, well, let me back up. I'm going to say this multiple times throughout this presentation. The easiest thing in this transaction, if the city were to decide to do it, is my job, issuing bonds. It's given the city's credit, given that this is a fixed rate issue, it's a fairly easy process. I'm in and I'm out. But it's after that where all the difficult things kind of need to happen. So the first one is upon issuing your pension obligation bonds, we need to make sure that the investment, the place that you park your bond proceeds, are going to exceed the interest rate of the debt that we do. So just as an example, if we issue 3.5% taxable debt, we need to make sure that our earnings at PSPRS are above that amount, our earnings rate. Let's see here. Another thing is that even if we issue debt successfully and the PSPRS was to not achieve that rate above the 3.5%, that notional rate that we would issue it, we would be subject to potential market losses, because it's not just about the earnings rate. In this, it's also about protecting your principal. Investment risk. Let's see here. A POB financing generates significant proceeds at one time. So should we invest all those proceeds at one time? And where I'm going with is let's put us in last year where we had just entered COVID and we weren't sure where the market was going, how bad COVID was going to affect excise tax revenues or the city's revenues. And also we weren't sure what was going to happen with the overall economic market. So even if we were able to borrow at a very, very low rate, how do we throw that into the market? Do we feel that the market is so great that we can't lose and just throw it all at once? Or do we slowly release into the market, trying to do a dollar cost averaging and protect your principal? Let's see, another investment risk is overfunding. So let's say that we were to completely 100% fund the city's unfunded liability. Let's say PSPRS just tears it out of the park and it's just positive earnings upon positive earnings. Can the city take a portion of that money back above and beyond what they owe? No, they cannot. It has to sit there. And they can use it towards future liabilities, but it's not like a checking account where they can go get that money back. Let's see, financial risk. POBs convert a soft liability into a hard liability. What does that mean? It means that right now you have a soft liability in your annual unfunded contribution. However, if we're trying to fund that up front with bonds, it's no longer soft. You are now on the hook for your bond debt service payments every year. The city would have come out 3 basis points ahead, so just barely. That's the point of this. Next slide, please. One more point of perspective. This is an earnings chart for Standard & Poor's 500, and it shows a 50 years history. And what I really like about this chart is it shows the volatility of the market. And it shows in certain series, let's start in, for example, 1995. If you were to have invested your money in 1995 through 1999, you would have made a killing. With a positive 34% the first year, 20 the next, 31 the next, 26 the next, and 19 the next. So that would have been great timing to issue debt and enter the market. Let's say that you were to do so in 2000. You issue debt and then you lose 10% of your principal that you put in, and then the next year you lose 13%, the next year you lose 23%, and then you start to earn money again. So the whole point of this chart is volatility, and when you put your money into the market, because compounding is going to define whether this is a good deal or a bad deal for the city. Pat, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I just, the only thing I would like to add is that I think when you mentioned about PSPRS and their investment practices and portfolio has improved, they've also done a lot of policy changes. And so as far as how they calculate future raises of people in the system, and then retirement ages, and then different changes to the program. So there's been a lot of other things that have been done, even in the last year. So there's a lot to consider again as I get into the summary about these things.
Pat,
Yes.
just real quickly on that last chart, if I could give a real-life example about timing. So there was an Arizona issuer that issued debt last year, approximately a year ago, and they issued about $20 million. Before the first year was up, they had to write a check for $500,000 to cover the deficit as a result of the losses in the market after the issuance of their debt. So they issued their debt. They were 100% funded, green light all the way, and then half a year later had to write a $500,000 check. Since then, the market has improved quite a deal, and so now they're back in the positive. But the point is when you're issuing big debt like that, and a few months later you have to write another big check, it might be a little scary. Pat, please.
Okay. So the potential advantages of pension obligation bonds is that it will stabilize. We will know how much we're paying if we have a pension obligation bond on annual unfunded liability contributions. And we will achieve present and future value savings. Those are the advantages. The potential disadvantages is that, again, it introduces leverage into the pension risk profile.
Pat, if I may on that one, in our discussion, there was a little confusion as to what the introduction of leverage means here. And if I can just kind of clarify that by saying it a different way. So introducing leverage, what that means is we're already in the hole with the unfunded liability. And by bond funding that, we're doubling down. We're taking an additional risk on top of that to try and make it better. So that's what introduction of leverage means.
Okay, and maybe you want to comment on the second one too, Michael. That second bullet, PSPRs may not achieve all-in TIC.
Right, so we said this a couple times throughout the presentation. We'll say it a little differently here. So again, I'm just choosing a notional amount. If we issue debt at 3.5% and PSPRS over the period of time does not earn 3.5%, and it earns lower than that, then that's a potential loss.
Right.
So not only would we have the unfunded liability that we kind of funded, but now we would have to pay potentially additionally if those earning rates aren't there.
Okay. The next one is it's an analogy to a home equity loan, where you take out a home equity loan and then you use the proceeds to invest in the stock market. And on the surface, you can say, oh boy, that sounds like a big risk. It is, because there is risk involved, no matter what decision you make. And if you did that, there's a risk that you could take out the home equity loan, have a higher mortgage payment, and then not achieve the interest that you thought you were going to get or capital gains in the stock market. I think a common misunderstanding of the unfunded liability is that if you sell pension obligation bonds and pay for it, you still have to pay for it. You have to pay it back out of excise taxes. So there really isn't any cash flow savings that are now available to fund fire, police, or anything in the general fund to be that's paid for out of the general fund. It just doesn't free up the cash. It's addressing the problem of your unfunded liability, but it's not freeing up money that you can do elsewhere within the budget. Some other common takeaway points are low rates. You borrow low, potentially earn low.
If I may on that one, Pat, so just by way of analogy, so if you're thinking, of boats sitting on water, if the water goes low, all the boats go low. If the water goes high, all the boats go high. And that's the way it is with regards to, the market and interest rates. Right now, earning or borrowing rates are really low, but also earning rates are relatively low too. So when borrowing rates go higher, so do earnings rates on investments. So everything kind of moves together. I just want to make that clear, because just because we're borrowing at very low amounts doesn't mean we're going to go out there and hit 15, 20, 30%.
And I think an analogy on the next one would be good, Michael, too, on your asset value versus your earning rate.
Okay, so I've said this one before, but again, it's important. So in doing a pension obligation bond and in putting the money into the plan, it's not just about the interest earnings rate. it's also about protecting that principal balance. So if we put in $10 million and in the first year we lose 50%, we now have a principal balance of $5 million. The next year we earn positive 50%, we're only at $7.5 million. So the next year, even if we have a good earnings rate, we're still earning interest only on that $7.5 million. We're still not earning on that $10 million that you borrowed and put in. So protecting that principal balance is really important.
So for next steps, this is a lot of information for council to absorb. No matter what option the council considers, there are risks involved, which we have identified. There's no easy answer to this problem. But the one thing that we do know is that the problem's not going away either. And that the timing of the low market rate is something that we really have to look seriously at on whether or not it makes sense. Maybe not 100%, because I can't emphasize what Michael said earlier enough, that if you overpay it, you're not going to get that money back. And that's a risk to itself. That's nothing worse than finding out you paid more than you should have for your unfunded liability. I think that what we're going to do next is Jean, Michael, and I, and John, and Robert are going to continue and analyze and research on paying the unfunded liability. How does the council going to do this? How are you going to tackle it moving forward? We talked about it last year about contributing $2 million and that's it, and it didn't pay off at that point. But there were a whole lot of different assumptions with PSPRS last year, and earnings were at zero, bottom line. So the staff, myself and Michael are going to run various analysis with GovInvest. That's the company you hired. It's like an actuarial to run numbers against what PSPRS is saying, because PSPRS is saying that if we earn the 7.3, you're going to save this. But what we'd like to do is look at different analysis and have this company run the analysis. You have invested in the software, and the people behind it are very, very smart, and they're very good at this. And they did it last year, and we're going to be turning to them again and helping us look at different alternatives of funding. We need to find a sizing option. In other words, are we going to do 50% of the liability? If we are going to do POBs, does 50% make sense? Is anything less than that may not make sense? Anything higher than that might be higher of a risk. So those are things we still have to look at. And then once we do that and we come up with, okay, here's what we feel comfortable with, knowing what we know now. The recommendation that I've made to the town or to the city is that you complete a 5-year financial forecast and you make sure that you are looking at all the different factors, economic factors that are associated specifically with the city of Nogales over the next 5 years on revenue and expenditures. And one of the person that I recommended to do this is Jim Rounds and Rounds Consulting. He is a very, very well-known financial consultant with the league, with the state. He has done tons of economic forecasting, and he brings the financial side of it. And with the work that we've done in finance on providing the budget over the last 2 years, we have a bunch of historical information. He can take that information and put together the 5-year forecast so that there's some discussion about, well, what does it do year 2, year 3, year 4, and 5? But in the meantime, we know we got to come up with some solution if you are going to go with POBs right now. So that's why we're running all this different analysis. And then we want to schedule a work session meeting for an update on potential strategies to mitigate this city's unfunded liability. It's good to get all this information and hear all sides of it, but we know that we need to come back with some numbers behind some recommendations. And that's what me and Jean and Michael will be working on between now and the time we schedule the next work session. So with that, I'll turn it over to council with any questions.
Michael, since you're the expert in pension obligation bonds, can we afford?
Can you afford them? Well, I could even ask that question back to you. Can you afford not to do them?
Well,
and I'm sorry.
go back. How much do you estimate that we would pay in a year, just so that I can know when you're talking?
Well, that
3 million or what?
That really depends on how much you depend to attack that unfunded liability. Are we going to do it 50%, 75%? 100%. And I wasn't trying to be sarcastic when I re-asked that question to you. I was just trying to say that there are two ways to look at it. So I think a lot of cities are looking at it as a silver bullet, if you will. And like, if we don't do this, there's no other way we're going to catch up. Maybe that's true. Maybe if we did this today, again, it's one of the best deals because of the way PSPRS is going to earn the best deals that you've ever done. And that's why I asked that. I mean, it really can go both ways. But I do understand your question. So let me try and answer it a little bit better. Pat, could you please pull up page 5?
Okay, one second.
So in that column that is highlighted yellow, that is your unfunded liability annual contribution. So if we were to do a bond deal, just to make it simple, and pay off your entire unfunded liability, that column would go away. Now, you have debt service payments. So your debt service payments would be in that range. Depending on, again, if we did 50%, 100%, it would take out a portion of that. So that's, would be kind of where you would fill in that money to pay debt service. And that partially answers your question as to whether we can afford them. Pat, fair?
Yeah, and let me add that he's presenting from a financial advisor. I'm presenting from your financial consultant, working with cities and towns. And that's why I recommend that you do a 5-year forecast so you know if you can afford it moving forward. We're going to look at what it is as far as what you have in the budget this year, and we can make some assumptions for the next 5 years, but we really need to drill down and do some what-if scenarios. If the sales tax would drop, if it would increase, what impact does the border have on your sales tax collections for the future? There's just a lot of different things for consideration. So the question about whether or not you can afford it is whether or not this is a priority to you to get at least started on this unfunded liability and take advantage of the market. So those answers are still to come, whether or not, depending on how much pension obligation bonds we either recommend that you sell.
Councilmember Montiel, I would add though, so let's say I'm looking at this yellow column. Let's say that we funded all of this cash flow 100% upfront. Let's say the PSPRS doesn't earn what it should and earns, a very low amount, 0, 2%. So now that unfunded liability starts to come back. So now we have to pay debt service, and then we have to now pay a new calculated unfunded liability. Yes, sir.
So we have $2 million that we can throw into the PSPRS and we can throw it into investing, right?
Pat, you confirm, but yes.
Yes, we have 8.3 million
Okay.
in our unassigned fund balance, to be honest. That's how much we have, but that's for everything in the general fund.
Yes. Okay. So let's just say for the sake of argument, we would put in $2 million, invest it with PSPRS. I went to a conference with them a couple of weeks ago, and they showed us some numbers that Pat mentioned that our goal or our target is 7.3 per year, right? So, but they went back in the past 5 years, and their average was 8.5%, not 7.3. Now, and I think this year was at a 20-something. It was pretty good.
Close to, yes.
Right? So can we invest, and again, I'm not real savvy on these type of numbers, but what would happen if we would invest these $2 million a year back? We get our interest, let's just say, for sake of argument, we got 8.5 or 9% back, and we would reinvest the what we got from the interest, invest that in and sort of create that self-running system for the PSPRS. Can that be done?
So with the contributions, that's what the actuarial is assuming is that compounding. So that's what you've asked is already occurring, council member.
Okay.
But that's not specific to just the 2 million. That's just whatever you put into the plan.
And again, it gets back to all the risk associated with it and how much you're gonna put in, and that's why we're gonna go back to GovInvest, because when we did that scenario before, they had earned 0%. And so they've changed their assumptions, they're earning 25% now, that doesn't mean they're gonna earn that in the future. And so that's why that looks really good on paper, but we wanna do a reality check based on, because it's based on your assets too, on yours, not overall, but on yours. So they're looking at all the cities and towns.
And-
So, right, Michael?
Correct. And then just again, to kind of point on your questions, you had said, well, over the past 5 years, they've earned, let's say, 8%, right? So that goes back to that table where I showed their historicals, where you see from year to year what they've done, and you can see what happens over a 10-year time frame, a 20 and a 30. So it all depends when and how you put that money in.
So do you think it's sustainable to at least get 8.5 back in their investment?
Is it sustainable to get
Yeah.
8.5 back long
You
term?
think you don't think that that's sustainable? Or I know it's we had a pretty good year as far as receiving our interest, but I don't think we're going to getting back 20 plus every year. I mean,
No, I think even 8% is going to be hard to reach every year. And that's kind of the argument that a lot of municipalities are having with their plans, is the 7.3 is a pretty aggressive rate.
because I've seen some numbers where I think 1 year they got a 5.3 back or something like that. So certainly there's risk. But you go back 5 years, and Ms. Walker says, well, let's do a 5-year study, and I think it's all great. But we can look back, and with COVID and everything, and we still had sort of a good year at 8.5, or so I think things are going to get better, hopefully. But I believe that it's not a matter if we can afford it. I think that we have to do it now when I think it's manageable. I don't want to wait 10 years or 15 years to address this, So I'm hoping to see what you guys can come up with that study with the 5 years and.
Okay. And I think those are all good points. I would just point out again, too, that the reason that this looks especially good right now, a POB, is because taxable rates are on the floor. And so in a year from now, they're probably not going to be there. 10 years from now, they're probably not going to be there. So one thing is clear. I can't say that I'm recommending the city do a POB because we don't know what's going to happen after we issue the debt. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that we are at the floor, and if you were going to borrow, now is the time to do that. If that makes sense. Not recommending, just saying rates are low.
Yeah, I understand that now's the time to, if we would borrow, go down that path, I think now's the time. But my question is, and again, forgive me for my lack of understanding. So let's say we would borrow money. So we would be, let's say that we paid off our PSPRS. So then we would be paying off this loan that we got to pay this off, and then on top of that, then we would be on the hook for, let's say, 20 years on this type of loan?
So if we were to do this financing, we would likely match it to that yellow column, which goes to 2038. So we would be doing that for 17 years approximately.
Okay.
Okay. And on top of that, we still have obligations with the PSPRS, with the tier 3s technically, right?
Well, so if everything goes according to plan, nothing goes positive, nothing goes negative, every assumption goes as is, and you 100% funded your unfunded liability today, that yellow column goes away. And the only thing that you would have to fund is your normal cost contribution column, which is right left of that.
Okay.
But that's not to say, Michael, just again, to emphasize that the unfunded liability could come back to a certain degree, even if you fund it, because of the fact that there's so many assumptions that go into it. Correct?
Correct.
Mr. Mayor? So Michael, even if the council were to decide today that they want to move forward with issuing the bonds to pay the unfunded liability, even if they were able to decide today to borrow the money at 100%, 50%, 75%, whatever percentage, when could you potentially close this deal? How long does it take to go through the
For
process?
this particular transaction, it's going to take just a little bit normal than your typical MDA deals, and we're also nearing year-end, December, so the bond market pretty much shuts down mid-December, reopens mid-January, maybe a little earlier than that. So could we get a deal done in that time? Yeah, but mostly everybody's away, so it's just going to cost the city more. So we would wait till late January to early February to issue and close bonds. And also at that, I would say too, that rates typically, with the exception of some economic global crisis, rates typically start going up at the end of the year because everybody's in a rush to get deal done. So there's oversupply, which trends rates upward. In early January and February, everybody's just coming back. There's a lack of supply, so there's more demand for municipal paper, especially quality paper like the cities. So rates would likely be lower beginning of next year than they would be at the end of this year.
And then another question, Michael, I have is the 5-year projected forecast report that we could get from Mr. Rounds. Is it Rounds? Did I say that?
Correct.
Mr. Rounds, how long would it take him to produce that report for mayor and council to look at, to maybe help them answer that question, how much can we afford, or should we?
I believe the answer is 1 month, but Pat is more familiar with this conversation, so Pat, please.
Yes, I would say at the max 2 months, but he could probably come back, definitely before we would have to go to the market and issue the bonds. And if we got to late January, then in the market change, that might change what you want to do too. But that's nothing we can do about that at this point. But what I really want to impress upon council is that this is a huge decision you will be making because of the fact that you are looking at what you're tying up in funding as a known here for future things that you want to do in the general fund. And that's why the 5-year forecast is so important, to really reflect what your true revenues are going to be over the next 5 to 10 years and what your true expenditures might be, with some room in there for if things happen. And just like we look at the budget every year, we look at how much money we have and revenues, and we look at ongoing versus one-time, and we look at, because one-time revenues, that's what they are, they're savings accounts, and you don't want to pay any ongoing expenses with one-time money. So that's why this is an important analysis, but Mr. Rounds can get it done within 2 months. He'll probably get it done in a month, but definitely within 2 months.
And then Michael and Pat, paying up front our unfunded liability, does paying it up front change our annual payments to PSPRS? Currently, it's about $4 million combined police and fire a year. Paying this liability up front, does that have any change on what we pay annually on top of, that we'll be paying back on these?
So what the bonds would be funding is that yellow column. And so if we were to for easy math, if we were to 100% both police and fire, then those yellow columns would go away. So yes, it would change the amount that you pay. It would drop it by, approximately those amounts annually.
But what I was referring to is the payment of the ongoing payments into PSPRS.
So those would still be there.
Yes, and so the question
I'm sorry.
is, so currently we pay $4 million a year, whether we have this problem or not. This is a different problem. We pay $4 million a year ongoing right now. My question is, if we pay off our unfunded liability, if we borrow the money and pay off the, what is it, $33 million? We give PSPRs $33 million. Does that change our normal annual contributions to the public safety retirement? Does it make it lower? Does it have no effect on it?
Your
Do
normal,
you see any savings there?
yes, your normal it wouldn't affect. Your normal it would not affect.
So it has no effect on it, in other words. And then just one thing that I heard when I think it's important for mayor and council, I think it's equally important for both chiefs. If we borrow this money to pay off this unfunded liability, it frees up nothing in the budget. Actually, we're adding expenditures to our budget. So just because we pay it off up front doesn't mean there's a boatload of cash for them to do.
An analogy would be having a really expensive credit card with a large balance on it, taking out a home equity line, paying off that credit card, and now thinking that you got all that credit card left.
Right.
Go
But
ahead, I'm
it's
sorry.
important to paint the picture of the problem that we're facing and what it looks like.
And Mr. Kissinger, if you're done, to go back to the whole presentation again, I know we have a lot of things going on here, but if I could just make it a little bit easier to understand, let's take the bonds out of it. And let's say that Nogales is cash rich and that in your general fund, you have the money to pay off today your fire and your police unfunded liability. The question is, does it make sense to give that money to PSPRS all at once and today? What if they do a great job? Then it was a great idea to give it all to them today. What happens if they have a bad couple of years? So that is really the essence of understanding what's going on here. It's not so much about the bonds. I mean, eventually they do come into play and they're important here, but the biggest idea is once you hand over that money,
Mayor. So that's pretty much the presentation. What we probably would be looking for direction is for both Pat, Gene, and Michael to come back with some funding options that if we were to go. And I think as we went through the presentation, Michael, there's only one funding option available to us.
for all intents and purposes, that is correct.
Going to the voters to do a property tax, and that won't happen until, and I don't know if there's a political will to do that. Yeah. The other is leveraging our property, which I think is already.
I think I'll take it out of the chief's checkbook.
So our property's already leveraged, so I don't think that's an option for us to move forward with. I don't know, Michael, when we produce the list of our buildings that are up for collateral.
Yeah, they're encumbered by the leasehold interest from your MDA, yes.
Is the new bank building and our golf course included in that? Do you know?
I don't think that they would have added the bank building. I know I didn't, and I don't think the attorneys would have known to add it, so I don't believe that's encumbered, and I don't know about the golf course.
Okay. And just for a wild, crazy question, if we were to put those two assets up, would it cover this type of, is that something we can look at?
So that's a very good question. If to do a COP deal, you're going to need an asset bucket that's going to cover 80% loan to value. So if you did 10 million, you're going to need 8 million in city buildings.
So we're doing 33 million, right?
Right.
That's what we'd be borrowing?
Yeah, so
If we did 100%, it would be 33 million.
well, if we did the 33 million, then what, we need 80% of that. What's that, 25 million in assets, building assets?
So just to put into perspective, how much we need in buildings.
Now, so interesting about Flagstaff. So when I say 80%, I'm giving you a ballpark. There are certain issuers who have gone and issued at loan to values less than 80%. I think Flagstaff was close to 60%.
Wow.
So, that's a big difference.
And so the other small problem is doing is it called the excise tax? Is that what it's called, Michael?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the downside of doing that is, one, it'll probably have an effect on our rating. So that'll affect us going forward. The other
And
problem.
may I expound on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what does affect the rating of the Nogales credit mean? Does it mean that you're going to pay now more interest on your outstanding bonds? No, it does not. Those are fixed rate bonds. They are going to stay the way they were when they issued, and you're going to continue to pay the same amount on them. What a rating decrease would mean to you is that for this upcoming issue, you would be paying a slightly higher yield premium. So maybe 40, 50, maybe a whole percent. I don't think it's a percent, but just to give you an idea on your debt to be issued going forward.
Or any other debt you would issue moving forward.
Correct.
And the other downside of borrowing the 33 million to pay off debt would be that we're tying up our, for lack of a better term, our credit line.
Yep,
So if
your
we
one credit card.
If we pull the trigger to borrow this 33 million, there might not be room for any future going to the bank for
Capital
a
infrastructure
substantial amount of
emergencies,
time.
man.
Now, I just have one other question, Michael.
Please.
Forgive me. We currently have debt out there. Is there room within our current debt to restructure that debt to alleviate some of this problem? And I forgot to ask you that the other day, but, and I know
So that's a good question, but it's a little complicated for a few reasons. So first off is that when we issue bonded debt, it's not like a home mortgage, right? Where I can go do a home mortgage today, and in a week from today I go and find a lower rate, and there's no cost for me to refinance, no penalty for me to refinance. In bond deals, usually there's a 10-year par call. And in 2018, the IRS changed its regulations, and we are no longer allowed to advance refund debt. So we would have to wait till the bonds are callable. As a result, to answer your question specifically, if we were going to restructure the debt service so that we could layer in some more, it would be very expensive to do that.
not feasible, not worth looking.
No, sir.
Thank you, Michael. Mr. Mayor, thank you.
One question.
Yes, ma'am.
Going back to affecting other debt we have, is the WIFA included in this?
That is a separate credit. The WIFA loans are, you have
Yeah.
water and wastewater, and they're secured by those
So
enterprises.
they're secure, so they wouldn't affect the?
No, ma'am.
Okay, them in any way, okay.
There's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
It's enough to keep you up at night, Mayor.
Somebody said that during the interview about people staying up at night. This is one of them.
33 million reasons.
I know it's not my money, but it's city's money and the pension money. And, just to think about this growing and growing and growing and paying into it and growing and paying into it and growing, doesn't seem you're gonna get out of it, never gonna get out of it.
So, Mr. Mayor, without hearing anything specific from mayor and council, I think our direction would be to have the team look at some potential finance option, bring back to the table what it would cost to borrow at 100%, 75, 50, and different. But more importantly, I also think that it would be in our best interest to have Mr. Rounds do that 5-year projection. Even if we didn't even use that 5-year just for this problem, that 5-year projection is going to help you make decisions going forward no matter what. Not only for this issue, but for any issue. It's going to tell you where you're going to stand each year going forward. And it's a great tool to have, and we should have it, and we should also renew it every year. So at the end of, we'll always have the 5-year in front of us. that would be the direction that I would like to receive and give to staff and our consultants to move forward on, Mr. Mayor.
All right, make sure you bring the best options that are out there, not, all of them, just the best ones. All right. Now, once you know we can really, do, I know you're gonna come up with it. I know which ones are probably gonna be in front, but, I think that's something that we could sit down and make a decision. That's the way I feel on that. I think would be. So let's go that route then. You think that's a good one?
Yes.
Michael or Pat or Gene, do you need anything else from Mayor and Council to move forward?
No, sir, not for me. I just wanted to thank Mayor and Council for staying awake through the whole presentation.
It's tough.
Mayor and council, I just, again, I appreciate, getting into this and the push to understand this, and so that you make the most informed decision as you do moving forward. And like I said, I think that if you look at this presentation and you think of something that you want to follow up on or another thought that comes in mind, just let John know and we'll make sure we cover that. So we know it was a lot of information we presented to you, and we know you may need some time to study it, and if so, you have any questions or anything, Michael or I or Gene will be glad to answer them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gene.
So with that. Yes. Motion to adjourn.